Hello, welcome to the notes over chapter 17. I'm going to try and record some notes here for you guys to use. This is Human Health and Environmental Risks. This is chapter 17. Make sure you read the chapter also. So I'm just going to give the various key essentials as we go through these notes. So let's get started. Oops, I got to click on this to make sure that we're on the right slide. All right, there are three categories of human health risks. This is kind of pertinent to what's going on right now in the world. We have physical, biological, and chemical. Physical is like earthquakes and tsunamis and tornadoes and things like that. These are human health risks that we have that are considered physical. Biological would be diseases. Diseases like what's going on right now. We can take all the different diseases, whether it's the flu or a cold or anything like that, that is a disease, bacteria or virus based or protist or whatever we're talking about. All of those are going to fall under biological. And then chemical are just chemical risks that we have, and we'll talk about those as we go through the slides today. All right, now we have a slide here, the leading causes of death in the world, and you look at these, and number one is and always has been cardiovascular disease. That's through all age groups pretty much, except for if you're very young, you don't have cardiovascular. But as you become an adult, cardiovascular disease is, I think it's 1 in 5 adults will end up dying from cardiovascular disease. But cardiovascular disease, 29% of people. Infectious disease is broken up into multiple categories there. You see that you have respiratory infections are number one, which is kind of what we're dealing with when we have cold and flu season. You get lots of respiratory infections. HIV/AIDS is always on the AP test. I don't know if it will be this year, but it is one that ends up on the AP test since this year is only going to be FRQs. So these are the key, and we're going to talk about emerging diseases and historical diseases and things like that, and we'll get into that more as we talk through the slides today. All right, biological risks. These are infectious diseases, those caused by infectious agents known as pathogens. Examples, pneumonia, venereal diseases, viruses, all of these are considered infectious diseases. And we can break these into two types of diseases. We have chronic diseases and acute diseases. A chronic disease slowly impairs you. It takes a long time. You can think of cancer would be a chronic disease because it takes a very long time for cancer to take hold of your body and then to do all the damage to your body before it kills you. Acute diseases are ones that come on very, very quickly, like the flu, things like that. Like a lot of times when you get diarrhea and things like that, it comes on very, very fast. Those are acute diseases that you can get. All right, this is my slide, leading health risks in the world, and it's broken down into low-income and high-income countries. The low-income countries and the high-income countries have some similarities, but the reasons behind a lot of these aren't the same. The number one reason for health risks in low-income countries or developing countries is low weight during childhood. If you have low weight, that means you're not eating enough. You're not eating enough, your body's not able to grow correctly. High blood pressures on both sides, and you can have genetic dispositions for high blood pressure, but a lot of it comes with stress and eating the wrong foods and things like that. Unsafe sex, this venereal diseases, unsafe water and sanitation isn't even on the high income side because we have safe water to drink. High blood glucose, that's going to be number 2 on the high income countries because we eat a lot of foods that are high in sugar. That's it. We eat a lot of foods that are high in carbohydrates. Indoor smoke from solid fuels, we don't even see that in developed countries because we have electricity to run everything for ourselves. Tobacco use is number 1 in high-income countries, and it's down on the list for low-income countries. That goes with smoking cigarettes, vaping, tobacco with dip, and things like that. Physical inactivity, you're going to find that on both sides. Suboptimal breastfeeding, you're going to find you don't really find that in developed countries because we have prenatal care and we preach the importance of that. And then high cholesterol is on both sides. Again, you can have genetic predispositions for that also. On the other thing, on the high income side, you're going to see overweight and obesity on this side because of our diets. You're also going to see low fruit and vegetable intake because we don't eat as many fruits and vegetables as others do. Outdoor air pollution because we end up having a lot of air pollution, alcohol use, and then occupational risks. All right, some historical diseases to talk about. I'm going to change my page right here. Historical diseases like the plague, it killed millions of people. We called it the Black Death. It is a bacteria, so we do have antibiotics. If it's a bacteria, we can have antibiotics that can kill it. Back then, we didn't have the antibiotics when the plague was running loose. Malaria is a protist. It was spread by mosquitoes. And we now have medications you can take for malaria. And then tuberculosis, which is also a bacteria. 9 million people every year still get tuberculosis, and 2 million people die from it. We do have resistant strains, meaning that our antibiotics that we have for tuberculosis don't work, and they've become resistant to those. And we have many different bacteria that are becoming more and more resistant to the antibiotics we use because of how much we use the antibiotics. So these are 3 of the most popular historical diseases that they put on the AP test. Now we can talk about emergent diseases. These are emerging diseases that they've shown, and I should put one on here that is not. HIV/AIDS is on every single AP test I've ever seen. It's almost always on the multiple choice, and since they're getting rid of the multiple choice this time, I don't know if it's going to be on there. But I would make sure you know everything you need to know about HIV and AIDS. It's in your book. How it emerges and how HIV works is you get the infection. You can get it through blood. You can get it through sexual intercourse. You can get it through a couple of different ways, and it basically attacks the T cells in your body. And by attacking the T cells and lowering your T cell count, you can't fight off other diseases. And once your T cell count gets low enough, you're then said to have AIDS, acquired immune disease syndrome, and acquired immune deficiency syndrome. So basically, no one really dies from AIDS. They die from complications with AIDS, because you get AIDS and your body can't fight off other diseases, so you could get pneumonia. And then since your body can't fight the pneumonia off, you die from a pneumonia. Or you could get the flu, or you can get a number of different diseases. So you actually don't die from AIDS, you die from complications from AIDS, and it's usually another disease that's marked as the cause of death. Ebola started in the Congo around the mid-70s. It usually causes death in 2 weeks. We now have a tentative treatment for Ebola, but it's still in testing, and it's showing that it's working pretty well, but it is very expensive. Mad cow disease is a prion disease in the brain, and the way it transfers to humans is what ends up happening is the cow shows mad cow disease, and they killed the cow, but they ended up feeding the cows to other cows, and then we ate that meat and we transferred to humans that way. Bird flu. Bird flus and swine flu, avian and swine flu have been around for thousands and thousands of years. Most of the flus that we have are either avian in nature or swine in nature, bird or pig. We had the big outbreak of bird flu several years ago, and it was pretty bad. And so we usually, it alternates. It passes either from bird to human or from pigs to humans, and goes that way. Spanish flu of 1918 that killed 100 million people was an avian flu. West Nile virus, usually spread with mosquitoes, and we spray in the Flower Mound Highland Village area every summer because if you're healthy, it usually just makes you a little bit sick, but it can kill the elderly and the very young whose immune systems aren't as strong. So we spray for mosquitoes to make sure they're dead. One of the telltale signs is if you have West Nile in your area is you'll find birds that are dead, and just like laying in your yard or laying in a field and stuff like that, because they are very susceptible to West Nile. The only other one that on here that I should put on here that should be making its way onto the AP test is Zika. Zika's been around long enough now for us. It started during the Olympics a few years ago in South America. Zika basically eats the brain of fetuses. And basically you have malformed heads, and the kids don't live very long after they're born. Zika virus, you never know when you have it. You'd have to get tested. Basically, you wouldn't know if you could go and live your entire life as an adult and have Zika and have nothing happen to you until you get pregnant and have a child, and the child will be born with a mal-shaped head because of the Zika virus. And so they always encourage more testing for the Zika virus in South America. All right, just as routes of transmission, everybody should know these by now, the ways that you can get different diseases transmitted to you. All right, now we're going to move on to chemical risks. Neurotoxins, these are chemicals that disrupt the nervous system. If you have like a can of Raid that you spray on bugs, that's a neurotoxin. This is what we use. It attacks the nervous system and kills the insects that way. Carcinogens, we've talked about these before, chemicals that cause cancer. We have lots of these: asbestos, radon, formaldehyde, tobacco, different things like that. Teratogens, chemicals that interfere with the normal development of embryos or fetuses. This is why they tell you not to drink alcohol while you're pregnant, because alcohol is a teratogen. It can pass the placenta and cause problems for the fetus. Allergens, if you're allergic to anything, the chemicals that cause allergic reactions, penicillin. I'm allergic to codeine. There's many things out there. If you have allergies to, because it's spring right now, and as everything is blooming, you might be sneezing and have a snotty nose and all that stuff right now. Endocrine disruptors, they like putting these on the AP test. Chemicals that interfere with the normal function of hormones in an animal's body. Your hormones basically regulate your body, and if you have something that is an endocrine disruptor, it will throw your hormones out of whack, and that can have a huge effect on how your health is. Dose response, LD50, the lethal dose that kills 50% of the individuals. So this is how they go about trying to find a way to cure different diseases. They need to find out what the lethal dose is, the LD50, and the effective dose. This is that causes 50% of the animals to display the harmful but non-lethal effects. So somewhere in between there is where they're wanting to get to find an effective dose. And so when you read up on this in your book, make sure you pay particular attention because they really like to talk about this on the AP test. We have different types of dose studies also. You can have an acute study, which is a very short-term study, or you can have a chronic study, which is a study over a long period of time. Most of the time we do acute studies because they're not as expensive as chronic studies. You can have a retrospective study, meaning you're looking at a disease that happened previously. You could go back and look at the 1918 Spanish flu and do some research on that, or you can become an epidemiologist. An epidemiologist is somebody who studies different types of diseases around the world. You can have a prospective study, which is what an epidemiologist would do, is they would look for what disease is coming, like what we're doing right now with what's happening in the world. With COVID-19 and how it's affecting the world. It's epidemiologists that are studying this and trying to figure out where it's going to hit, where it's going to spread to next, and things like that. All right, synergistic interactions. This is kind of, I always say this is my duh slide. It just makes sense, and it's something that I shouldn't have to say much about. Synergistic interactions, when two risks come together and cause more harm than one would. So if the health impact of a carcinogen such as asbestos can be much higher if you also smoke. So two bad things equal even worse. Duh. All right. Again, routes of exposure, different things that can expose you can be exposed to your fetus. So you have to be very careful whenever you're pregnant. Bioaccumulation. I'm going to talk about two things here. One's bioaccumulation and one is biomagnification. We've talked a little bit about bioaccumulation already. This is an increased concentration of a chemical within an organism over time. So the more you eat, the more it will accumulate in you. We've talked about this with what we eat. We talked about it with mercury, with the fish that we eat and sushi and things like that. To go along with this, though, is the next step, which is called biomagnification. Because if you look, the increase in the chemical concentration in animal as it travels through the food pyramid. So as it goes up from it being in the water and then the plankton eating it, then the one fish eats it, and then the next fish eats it, then a bird eats it, you're going to get the higher up you are on the food chain, the more biomagnification you're going to have because you're going to have even greater concentrations in you. All right, persistence. This is one of the things we look at for insecticides and pesticides and all that together, how long a chemical remains in the environment. So I have a list here. One of the big ones I want to talk about here is Roundup. Roundup is one of the most used. If you go to Home Depot or Lowe's and you're trying to get rid of weeds in your lawn, you probably are going to buy Roundup and spray it on there. Well, Roundup will stay from 7 to 70 days in water, depending on how much you spray in there. And atrazine is another herbicide that most farmers use whenever they're spraying on top of before they're trying to grow anything in their fields, they put atrazine down. Well, atrazine will stay for almost 224 days. That's a really long time. And then PCBs, which we've talked about before, PCBs can stay up to 15 years. That's why we try not to use PCBs anymore, because they're very, very persistent. And one of the things you're going to find when reading and researching a lot of this stuff is that herbicides, one of the big questions that people always have about herbicides, since we spray these on our foods, do they get into the food and then we consume it? And there's not been a lot of studies done on whether when you spray an herbicide or a pesticide or anything on foods that we eat, does any of it get into the food that we eat? All right. Risk analysis. This is kind of what's going on right now around the world, is these risk analysis with COVID-19 and everything that's happening with that. Risk assessments, they identify the hazard, what's the toxicity, and determine the extent of the exposure. Well, this is what's going on right now. They're looking at the hazard, which is COVID-19, characterize the toxicity. It's really bad for certain parts of our societies. And what's the extent of the exposure? Well, we're still in the exposure phase. And then you have risk acceptance, determine an acceptable level of risk balanced against social, economic, and political considerations. So what is the acceptable amount of risk? So people are dying from this disease that's out there right now, and what's the acceptable number of deaths that they're willing to take? And that's been around for a very, very long time. It's like people are dying from this. We know people are going to die from this. So what is the acceptable number? Right now, they're saying 100,000 people in the United States would be a really, really good number if we only had 100,000 people die. But it could go up to several 100,000 people that could die from this. And then risk management is to determine policy with input from private citizens, industry, and interest groups. So what is the risk management? How are we going to go through this? This is just a slide of causes of death. Right, let me slide around here. Leading health risks in the world. Oh, no, that's not. Wrong page. It's on my last page. This is probabilities of death in the United States. So, like I said, heart disease is number one, always has been number one. Number two is cancer, stroke. Stroke is scary because a completely healthy person can have a stroke. My dad's had 2 strokes already, and I'm having to take care of him more and more. Motor vehicle accident, falling, firearms, and things like that, and it goes all the way up to flood. So this just shows you a 1 in 5 chance of having heart disease, that's 20%, which is really, really high number. So if we look at our class, if we have 30 kids in the class, that means 6 kids in the class could have heart disease by the time they get to my age. Qualitative risk, making a judgment on the relative risks of various decisions, the probability of this. This says the statistical likelihood of an event occurring and the probability of the event causing harm. So what's the probability of this event happening? Oh, what did I do there? Let me go back to... No, I don't want to do that. There we go. I don't know why I hit that. The statistical likelihood of an event occurring, and then what's the likelihood of being harmed by that event happening, which is different from quantitative risk, where you're looking at the risk itself. What's the probability of being exposed to a hazard, and then the probability of being harmed once exposed. So this is one of the things we're going through right now with COVID-19. What's the probability of being exposed to COVID-19? We're supposed to basically stay at home, which is going to limit our exposure to COVID-19. But if you are exposed, what's the probability of being harmed if exposed? So since you could be exposed, if you're perfectly healthy, you might get a little bit sick. But if you could expose it to others, what's the probability of them being harmed? And that's why we're kind of being locked down in our houses, to keep the exposure down to where we aren't harming others. The Stockholm Convention in 2001, 127 nations gathered in Stockholm, Sweden, to reach an agreement on restricting the global use of some chemicals. 12 chemicals were banned, including DDT, PCBs, and certain chemicals that are byproducts from manufacturing. This is just a quick nuts and bolts of Chapter 17. I wanted to get this out there so you could see this. Also, remember to read the book and do all the questions. Thank you very much, and I will see you next time.